You know, usually when we try to understand a major cultural shift, um, we kind of expect scientific precision.
Right, like hard data.
Exactly. We tend to look at sociology the way a seismologist looks at an earthquake,
Yeah.
right? You feel a tremor, the instruments spit out this like jagged black line on a graph, and the experts point to the data and say, well, there it is.
Yeah, a 4.2 on the Richter scale.
Right. The tectonic plate slipped exactly 3 inches to the west. And I mean, it gives us a sense of control to believe that society moves in these measurable, binary ways. Happening or not happening? Clean, observable, and neatly filed away?
Well, it's incredibly comforting to view history through that lens, right?
Yeah.
We want our generational transitions to arrive with clear signposts so we can, prepare for the new normal. But that methodology just completely falls apart when the instruments themselves are being questioned.
Yeah.
Questioned by the very people experiencing the tremor, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. When you step into the world of modern gender dynamics, institutional trust, and these sprawling digital subcultures that have just materialized over the last decade, that seismograph is essentially useless.
Oh, completely.
We're looking at a cultural landscape that is intensely murky. The tectonic plates beneath our feet are shifting rapidly, and while the surface level cracks are appearing in ways that defy conventional political analysis, we are dealing with millions of individuals who feel completely alienated from the very institutions that define modern life.
And that alienation isn't just like passive withdrawal. It's actively manifesting in new philosophies, parallel economies, and highly organized digital movements.
Yeah.
To understand the current moment, you have to look past the mainstream interpretations,
Right.
You have to go straight into the architecture of these emerging belief systems.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are going completely off the map to explore a deeply provocative new ebook published in 2025. It's titled Red Pill Reckoning, a guide to reclaiming masculinity and rejecting modern trends by Conrad Riker.
It is quite the read.
Yeah, it really is. But before we get into the mechanics of this text, we have a crucial directive for you, the listener. We need to explicitly state right up front that our approach today is entirely neutral.
Yes, 100%.
We are not taking a political side here. We are not endorsing Riker's worldview, and we are absolutely not here to validate, peer review, or legitimize his statistics.
Right. Our goal is purely analytical and architectural. Riker's book basically operates as a war manual for men's rights activists and what is broadly termed the manosphere.
Yeah, the manosphere.
He claims that Western institutions have been systematically captured and weaponized against men. And we're just here to impartially unpack those arguments, decode his intense rhetoric, and help you understand the psychological and economic frameworks shaping this cultural phenomenon.
Exactly. And the book actually carries a disclaimer referring to itself as edutainment, which functions as a rather clever legal and social shield.
Very clever.
But make no mistake, the core thesis driving these pages is deadly serious. Riker operates on the premise that modern men are being systematically stripped of their purpose, their wealth, and their biological imperatives.
He really pulls no punches.
He doesn't. Now, if you want to truly understand these cultural tectonic plates shifting beneath our feet, and specifically the history of how our modern institutions evolved before what this author describes as their total ideological capture by feminists and Marxists, you need to read this book.
You really do.
So I highly urge you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy a copy for yourself, and definitely follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for more. And hey, while you're at it, please hit that like and subscribe button right now to support our show.
Yes, please do.
It really helps us keep bringing you these unfiltered deep dives. So getting into it, it's an essential artifact for understanding a demographic that largely feels invisible to mainstream cultural commentary.
Yeah, because Riker doesn't just, list grievances. He constructs a comprehensive alternative reality.
So to understand his proposed solutions, which honestly eventually get into some incredibly wild cyberpunk-style survivalism, we first have to understand his diagnosis of the disease.
Right, the root cause.
Yeah. He begins his analysis right at the bedrock of human civilization, which is the family unit. Or, more accurately, what he calls the fatherless apocalypse.
Wow, fatherless apocalypse. By starting with the family, Riker is setting the ultimate stakes, right? He argues that the collapse of the nuclear family isn't just some sad sociological byproduct of modernity.
No.
He views it as a structural failure that guarantees the collapse of the broader civilization. Literally everything else he talks about later, like corporate culture, digital economies, speech laws, It all stems from this initial domestic unraveling.
And he throws out some incredibly stark statistics right out of the gate to paint this picture. Like, he claims that 85% of violent criminals grow up without fathers.
That's a huge number.
Yeah, it is. And on the flip side of that visceral street-level chaos, he points to this profound apathy among the non-criminal demographic. He states that 68% of men under 30 don't even have a will.
Right.
Their estate plan, as he cynically puts it, consists of an expired gym membership and a Steam library of digital video games.
A Steam library, yeah.
Huh.
The juxtaposition there is fascinating. I mean, he's illustrating a spectrum of male despair. On one end, the absence of the father figure results in destructive external violence.
Yeah.
And on the other end, it just results in this hollow internal paralysis.
He brings this to life with two very vivid anecdotes placed side by side. First, he talks about a guy he met in Inglewood, a former gang leader named Bloodshot.
Bloodshot, right.
Yeah, Bloodshot did 14 years for armed robbery, and Riker describes how this hardened man's hands still physically shake when he talks about never knowing his dad. Like, the psychological void of the absent father left a wound that prison and gang loyalty could never heal.
Right. And then Riker contrasts that street-level tragedy with corporate white-collar tragedy.
He introduces this dying 54-year-old corporate executive. This is a man who seemingly played by all the rules of the modern system, you know? He achieved wealth, status, corporate power.
A package.
Right. But his final words weren't a peaceful farewell whispered to his family. Riker shares this man's viral LinkedIn post, written literally from hospice care, where the executive deeply regretted answering late-night client calls instead of going to his son's Little League games.
Oh, wow.
The executive actually wrote, "Should have taught you to fix a carburetor instead of outsourcing your childhood to Xbox."
That is heavy. But, by placing Bloodshot and the dying executive in the same chapter, Roker is basically arguing that the current institutional system fails men regardless of their socioeconomic status.
Right.
Whether a father abandons his child physically, like in Bloodshot's case, or emotionally and temporally, like the executive, the resulting vacuum is catastrophic. Riker blames a society that prioritizes economic utility over biological duty.
And to hammer this point home, he looks outside the modern mainstream and points directly at the Amish community.
The Amish?
Yeah. He claims that the teenage suicide rate among the Amish is 90% lower than the national average. And he attributes this massive disparity entirely to the tangible presence of fathers and the nature of their work.
So they're physically present.
Exactly. Riker says that Amish boys aren't locked in their bedrooms debating gender pronouns on TikTok. They are outside, side by side with their fathers, raising visible barns that will outlive them.
Well, this is where we really have to unpack the evolutionary psychology framing that underpins Riker's entire worldview, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Because the Amish example isn't just about, fresh air and hard work. It's about the psychological necessity of tangible legacy. Riker brings up this biological example of the male bowerbird.
Oh, right, the birds.
Yeah. In the wild, the male bowerbird spends weeks building these incredibly elaborate, architecturally complex nests. They decorate them with colorful berries and shiny objects. And why? Purely to demonstrate his genetic value, his competence, and his ability to provide for a potential mate.
So the bird doesn't build the nest because society told him to. He builds it because his DNA demands it.
Precisely. That's the point Riker is making. He argues that the drive within human men to build, to provide, to leave a tangible physical legacy, whether that's a barn, a bridge, or a cathedral, is hardwired into their biology.
Right.
It is not a socially constructed behavior that you can just, educate out of a population
Right.
through progressive university curricula.
So when you place a modern man in an environment where he cannot build, where his daily labor results in manipulating spreadsheets, and his only domain to conquer is a digital video game settlement, his brain recognizes the artificiality of it.
Yes, absolutely. Riker views the modern condition where men are chasing digital follower counts or paying for parasocial relationships on OnlyFans instead of building physical structures as a literal perversion of human biology.
It's synthetic.
Exactly. The modern man's brain is flooded with the neurochemical rewards of quote-unquote building when he levels up in a video game. But the physical reality remains empty. Riker argues this dissonance is the root cause of the male mental health crisis.
I do want to push back on Riker's framing here, though. Let's look at this through, a historical and economic lens.
Okay.
Riker frames all of this as a deliberate, malicious castration of male purpose by captured ideological institutions. But is this really a malicious feminist or Marxist conspiracy, or is it just the inevitable, incredibly disruptive side effect of a rapidly digitizing capitalist world?
That's a fair question.
I think about the concept of legacy. Riker says a man's legacy in the 1800s was 40 acres and a mule. Today, it's an 87K gender studies debt and a Steam game library.
The shift from agrarian independence to digital serfdom.
Right. But did ideological institutions steal those 40 acres, or did the 40 acres just get economically replaced by massive server farms, corporate agriculture, and an economy that primarily values service and information jobs?
Well, capitalism optimizes for efficiency, yeah.
Exactly. We don't need millions of men to perform dangerous physical labor to build barns anymore because we have automated supply chains and advanced machinery. Isn't Riker blaming sociology for a problem created by technology?
And that is the essential counterargument, right?
Yeah.
Are we looking at deliberate ideological sabotage or simply the profound alienation of the digital age?
Yeah.
Riker actually acknowledges the technological shift, but he firmly believes that modern institutions weaponized that shift.
Weaponized.
Yeah, he argues that when the economy stopped demanding physical, dangerous labor from men, the culture didn't just reassign male ambition, it began actively pathologizing it.
Pathologizing it, meaning treating normal male behavior as a psychological defect.
Exactly. To Riker, it's not just that the opportunity to conquer the 40 acres is gone, it's that the very desire to conquer, to compete aggressively, and to dominate an environment is now treated in public schools and corporate HR departments as toxic masculinity. He argues that the institutions took a technological transition and used it as an opportunity to socially engineer male aggression out of existence.
Which provides a seamless transition into the next layer of his diagnosis. Because if the family unit is the biological foundation that is crumbling, religion and brotherhood have historically been the societal glue holding everything together.
Right.
And Riker argues that as the traditional churches emptied out over the last 50 years, modern secular institutions didn't just leave a neutral void, they filled that void with something much, much more punitive.
The substitution of traditional religion with secular ideology. Sociologists have observed this trend for decades, noting how political movements often adopt religious structures. But Riker gives this a very specific combative spin tailored to the male experience.
Yeah, he points his lens directly at the 2020 Portland riots. He paints this picture of grown adults smashing Starbucks windows, setting fires, and violently clashing with police while chanting slogans for a utopian society. And then he cites police demographic records claiming that 89% of those arrested during these riots had no religious affiliation whatsoever.
So he views the riots not as political protest, but as displaced religious fervor.
He calls them churchless souls, adrift in a world completely stripped of transcendent meaning, swapping traditional sacraments for Molotov cocktails. It's a really striking image.
It is.
And he pairs this external chaos with internal despair, citing a CDC statistic that claims atheist men are 5 times more likely to die by suicide than their church-going peers.
And this is where Riker introduces one of the most incisive and deeply debated concepts in the book, which he calls woke Puritanism.
Woke Puritanism.
Yeah, he argues that modern progressive institutions haven't abandoned religion, they have simply invented a new, secular one. And this new religion has taken the traditional theological concept of original sin and replaced it with the sociological concept of privilege.
But Riker points out a massive fatal flaw in this new secular religion, right? In traditional faiths, there is a mechanism for redemption. In woke Puritanism, there is none.
This is a critical distinction to understand his worldview. I mean, in traditional Christianity, for example, a 15th century blacksmith who committed a wrong could go to his priest, confess his sins, perform a specific penance, receive absolution, and be reintegrated into the community with a cleansed soul.
A clean slate.
Right, there was a defined, actionable pathway back to grace.
But Riker uses an amazing historical parallel here. He talks about the Knights Templar and their Rule 12.
Right.
This was a mandate requiring mandatory weekly confession for the brothers.
Right.
They were forced to sit down, look each other in the eye, hold each other strictly accountable for their failings, but crucially, they forgave each other. The structure of the Brotherhood was built on both intense accountability and guaranteed absolution.
Riker contrasts that historical mechanism with the modern digital ecosystem. Today, he argues, young men desperately seek validation and community on platforms like Twitter or TikTok. They're still searching for that congregation, you know.
Yeah, of course.
But the modern digital mob does not offer absolution. It only offers permanent, inescapable cancellation.
The screenshot is forever. The shame is eternal.
Exactly. If you violate the shifting moral codes of woke Puritanism, whether by using an outdated term, expressing a forbidden opinion, or simply being accused of an infraction, there is no penance you can perform that will clear the digital record.
Right.
An apology is often viewed merely as an admission of guilt, leading to further ostracization. Riker describes a generation of men basically crying into Twitter threads, begging for approval from a decentralized mob that views their destruction as a virtuous act.
So with the traditional church gone and the new secular religion offering only eternal damnation, what is Riker's antidote? Well, he advocates for a movement he calls beef and Bibles.
Beef in Bibles.
Yeah, he tells men to completely abandon the vegan yoga brunches and the corporate mindfulness seminars. Instead, he wants men forming small, localized, hypermasculine groups focused on three things: lifting heavy iron, grilling ribeye steaks, and reading scripture.
And crucially, doing so without any institutional oversight.
Right. Doing it without a university sociology student there to deconstruct the text or label the gathering as problematic. When you look at the landscape Riker has painted, a world of shifting, ambiguous rules where you can be canceled at any moment, you can instantly see why beef and Bibles appeal so viscerally to a massive demographic of men.
Oh, absolutely.
It's tangible, it's unapologetic, and it is entirely under their own control.
It appeals because it offers definitive clarity in an era of terrifying ambiguity. Modern corporate and social culture is defined by microaggressions, constantly evolving lexicons, and the concept of implicit bias.
Yeah.
You can easily violate a rule today that didn't even exist yesterday, and you might not even realize you violated it until the punishment arrives. Riker's proposed alternative, which he also refers to as monk mode, offers binary physical rules.
Yeah.
You lift the 300 pounds or you don't.
Right.
You read the text or you don't. The steak is cooked or it's raw. Reality responds to your effort, not your compliance to a speech code.
But let me challenge the core premise of monk mode, and this return to strict traditionalism for a second. Historically, religious institutions heavily policed human behavior. The actual 17th century Puritans put people in physical stocks in the town square for missing church or gossiping.
True.
Doesn't Riker's strict traditionalism simply replace one set of rigid rules, like a modern corporate HR guideline, with an older, equally rigid set of rules? You're just swapping the HR commissar with the clipboard for the medieval priest with the catechism. It doesn't seem like true freedom. It just seems like choosing your preferred authoritarian.
That is a very astute critique. Riker is not actually advocating for absolute libertarian freedom. He is advocating for a return to a specific hierarchy. He would likely counter your point by arguing that the medieval priest's rules, while rigid, were fundamentally aligned with biological reality and the project of building civilization. He actually has a line in the book, "Modern men build Netflix queues. Our ancestors built cathedrals."
That's quite the quote.
Yeah. He views the traditional rules as generative producing strong families, incredible architecture, and societal stability. Conversely, he views modern HR rules as parasitic and destructive, designed only to manage decline and police thought. But you are entirely correct to point out that beef and Bibles is still a highly structured system of behavioral control.
And this brings us to how this ideological control impacts men in the most measurable, painful way possible, their finances. Riker argues that the systemic punishment of men isn't just spiritual alienation or the loss of societal purpose.
Yep.
It is a direct, measurable financial drain facilitated by the modern legal system, the dating market, and the digital economy. He provocatively titles this section of his analysis "The Marriage Plantation and the Simp Economy."
This is the intersection where the red pill cultural philosophy really merges with hardcore financial libertarianism. Riker believes that the modern economic system is basically designed to extract male labor while denying men the traditional rewards of that labor.
To illustrate this, we have to look at the legal framework of modern divorce, which Riker views as entirely captured. The anecdotes he uses here are staggering. He details the story of a divorced electrician in Ohio in 2019.
Oh, this story.
Yeah. This man worked blue-collar hours for decades, climbing into attics and wiring houses, and managed to save a $250,000 401k for his retirement. According to Riker, during the divorce proceedings, the legal system awarded the entirety of that retirement fund to the ex-wife.
And it's how the capital was subsequently deployed that Riker uses to fuel his outrage.
Exactly. The ex-wife didn't use it to secure housing for their children or invest in index funds. She used the electrician's life savings to fund a startup business centered around sacred womb realignment.
Sacred womb realignment.
I am not making this up. Riker notes that this business plan included hiring an $800 an hour shamanic accountant who used astrology to balance the books.
A shamanic accountant. The absurdity of the expenditure is the point he's making.
The electrician is now allegedly living in a converted U-Haul box truck behind a strip mall, while his ex-wife is utilizing his lifetime of labor to host luxury ayahuasca retreats in Sedona. Riker uses this highly specific, enraging story to make his broader claim: the family court system views the modern man as nothing more than an ATM with a penis, a biological utility meant to generate capital for a system that actively despises him.
Right. Riker argues that marriage, once a protective contract for both parties, has been legally redefined to function as an extraction mechanism. But he also argues that men who avoid marriage aren't safe either,
Right.
The financial extraction has simply evolved to capture the unmarried men through the digital sphere.
This is where we enter the simp economy, which is Riker's term for the massive, unprecedented transfer of wealth from lonely, isolated men directly to online content creators. The courts don't get your money, your own biological desperation will.
To understand the simp economy, we have to understand the mechanism of parasocial relationships.
Let's break that down. He tells the story of a young cryptocurrency trader who managed to amass 69 Bitcoin. At the time, that was roughly $1.4 million in liquid wealth.
1.4 million.
This young man did not invest it in real estate. He didn't start a business. Instead, he systematically drained his wallet by sending super chats, which are essentially digital cash tips, to a single female Twitch streamer. He paid over $1 million just to have this streamer occasionally read his screen name out loud while she played video games.
And the devastating conclusion to that story.
The streamer eventually went on an anonymous 4chan message board and was caught mocking this exact donor, calling him a cheap simp who didn't tip enough.
Just brutal. But Riker uses this to highlight how digital platforms exploit the male biological urge to provide. In a traditional setting, a man provides resources to a partner and receives intimacy, loyalty, and a family in return. In the simp economy, the technology perfectly mimics the stimuli of the interaction. The streamer smiles, she says his name, and thanks him for providing, which triggers the neurochemical reward in the man's brain. But the reality is completely synthetic.
Yeah.
The man is being financially drained while remaining utterly alone.
It's an illusion of intimacy that costs a fortune. Riker brings up another example. A 25-year-old man, a self-described virgin, who spent $18,732 on OnlyFans subscriptions over 2 years.
Wow.
Riker Riley notes that this young man's digital pornography budget was roughly equivalent to the GDP of a small island nation like Tonga. Now, Riker claims this young man eventually hit absolute rock bottom, recognized the synthetic trap, deleted his accounts, and turned his life around. And you know what he's doing now.
Let me guess.
He is hand-forging Damascus steel knives in a garage while listening to Mongolian throat singing.
The pivot from digital subservience to hyper-masculine physical craft. It is the quintessential red pill redemption arc. But the overarching macroeconomic point Riker is driving at here is what he calls the beta male rebellion. He relies on Pew Research data, indicating that a staggering 63% of men under the age of 30 are currently single. He takes that data and categorizes the modern male population into these brutal, uncompromising factions.
He starts with the wage cucks. These are the men still playing by the rules of the system. The office drones who sit in cubicles, pay massive taxes, fund the OnlyFans empires through their drained bank accounts, and hope that if they just work hard enough, the system will eventually reward them with a wife and a house.
Yeah.
Riker views them with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust.
And opposed to the wage cucks are the volsuls, or voluntary celibates.
Yes. These are the men who have looked at the legal risks of marriage and the synthetic trap of the simp economy and decided to completely opt out. They embrace monk mode, they ignore women, they ignore mainstream societal expectations, and they focus entirely on maximizing their physical fitness, stockpiling cryptocurrency, and learning tangible survival skills.
Yeah.
Riker explicitly compares this demographic to Japan's herbivore men. Millions of Japanese men who have entirely rejected dating, marriage, and corporate ambition, which has caused Japan's national birth rates to absolutely crater.
Riker's analysis here relies on a very specific and highly controversial interpretation of evolutionary mating strategies. He posits that women are biologically driven to seek out alpha fucks for optimal genetic fitness, meaning physical attractiveness, dominance, and aggression, and beta bucks for financial security and resource provisioning.
Right, I've heard this theory.
Yeah, he argues that modern society has tricked the majority of men into playing the beta bucks role, paying the taxes, funding the alimony, tipping the streamers, without ever receiving the biological or societal respect afforded to the alpha.
So, because the game is rigged, Riker advises his readers to just flip the board over entirely. He advocates for a massive, coordinated sperm strike, or what some of the men he interviews refer to as financial seppuku.
Financial seppuku,
Yeah.
the intentional ritualistic destruction of one's own earning potential.
It's incredible. He details stories of men who purposely quit six-figure corporate jobs or intentionally shift into cash-only, untraceable trade labor. Why? Specifically so, their ex-wives cannot garnish their wages for alimony, and so the government cannot tax their high incomes to fund the social welfare state.
Wow.
Riker views this deliberate impoverishment not as a failure, but as a tactical strike to starve the matriarchy of the male tax base it relies on to function.
It's quite the strategy.
But wait, I have to stop and ask a fundamental question about the logic here.
Okay.
If we look back at Riker's own thesis from the very first chapter, he built his entire argument on the premise that men are biologically hardwired by evolutionary psychology to conquer, to build monuments, and to provide for a legacy. Right. But now he's telling a whole generation of men to go into deep isolation, to become herbivores, forging knives in the woods, and to purposely destroy their own wealth to spite their ex-wives. Doesn't this directly, fundamentally contradict their own biological imperatives? Is financial seppuku actually a rebellion, or is it just a massive, cowardly retreat? You aren't conquering Rome, you are just hiding in the woods while Rome continues on without you.
That is arguably the most profound contradiction in the entire manosphere philosophy.
Right.
Riker attempts to frame this withdrawal as a tactical strike. Withdrawing your labor and your capital until the terms of the societal contract are fundamentally renegotiated in men's favor.
Yeah.
He draws a direct parallel to Tyler Durden's chaotic Project Mayhem in the novel Fight Club.
Destroy the credit card records to reset the debt.
Precisely. But your critique hits the weak point. A biological imperative to build empires and raise barns does not mesh logically with a lifestyle of intentional poverty and digital isolation. Riker tries to bridge this massive gap by telling his followers to build parallel economies. He says, don't build for the mainstream system that hates you. Build decentralized Bitcoin networks. Build off-grid, self-sustaining communities. Build physical strength. So the drive to build remains, but it is redirected away from the institutions.
Which brings us directly to the mainstream institutions themselves. Because if a man takes this advice, unplugs from the dating market, and protects his wallet, he still has to walk into a building to earn a living. But Riker argues that the moment a man walks into the modern corporate office, he is stepping onto an entirely different ideological battlefield.
Right?
He titles this exploration Satan's Bureaucrats and the Corporate Battlefield.
Satan's bureaucrats being his highly inflammatory moniker for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI officers and corporate human resources departments.
He argues that the modern workplace, much like the family unit and the religious sphere, has been completely captured by ideological commissars. These are people who, in Riker's view, look at traditional masculinity not as a productive resource to be harnessed, but as a dangerous liability to be managed, suppressed, and eventually eradicated.
To understand how Riker mobilizes his readers, we really have to look at the specific corporate horror stories he chooses to highlight. He portrays a professional environment that has abandoned the pursuit of meritocracy and profit in favor of ideological compliance.
The examples he pulls are designed to induce maximum outrage. Like he dives into an initiative at Yale called the Privilege Walk.
Oh, this one.
Yeah, this is a mandatory seminar where employees are physically lined up, and based on their race, gender, and sexual orientation, they are told to take a step forward or a step back. Riker describes how white, heterosexual men are physically mandated to step to the very back of the room, symbolizing their inherent societal advantage, or, as Riker frames it, their original sin.
The physical spatial humiliation is what Riker focuses on there. It's not just a lecture, it's a bodily submission to the ideology.
From academia, he moves to the tech sector. He claims that IBM deliberately fired 7,000 highly competent male engineers specifically to free up the budget to bankroll a massive equity analytics platform run by consultants.
Wow.
And then he brings up the CEO of Virtue Motors. According to Riker, this CEO became so obsessed with progressive signaling that he prioritized painting rainbow logos on the dealerships and mandating 40 hours of allyship training over actual sales strategy. The result, The company's stock allegedly plummeted 63% in a 6-month period.
Riker uses these examples to construct a narrative of institutional suicide. He is basically arguing that these companies are willingly destroying their own efficiency and market value to appease the DEI commissars.
And of course, he provides a counterexample of a man who refused to comply. He tells the story of an HVAC business owner in Montana. This boss had a corporate DEI trainer come to his warehouse to give a mandatory lecture on gender fluidity in the workplace.
Right.
According to the book, the boss listened for 10 minutes, stood up, and physically threw the trainer off his property, famously declaring, "My bulls don't respect pronouns, and neither do my welders."
A moment of pure, unapologetic frontier defiance.
And Riker claims that following this expulsion, the HVAC company saw a 100% drop in internal HR complaints. And this is perhaps the most absurdly specific metric in the entire book, a 22% increase in the company's average deadlift numbers.
It is such a fascinating rhetorical move. Riker literally conflates raw physical strength metrics with corporate efficiency and morale.
But let's analyze how Riker frames this corporate HR culture.
Yeah.
He quotes a former Soviet-era dissident blogger who refers to modern human resources as the KGB with better pronouns.
That comparison is vital. Riker is intentionally likening modern corporate diversity training to Maoist struggle sessions from the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
No, interesting.
Yeah. In Mao's China, individuals who showed insufficient revolutionary zeal were dragged in front of their peers, publicly humiliated, and forced to loudly confess their ideological sins to avoid being purged. By drawing this historical parallel, Riker is telling his readers that everyday corporate compliance, putting your pronouns in your email signature, nodding along silently in an implicit bias workshop, isn't just a minor annoyance required to get a paycheck.
Right.
He frames it as an act of profound moral cowardice. He elevates mundane office politics to a civilizational battle for the male soul.
He also wades directly into the most contentious economic debate of our time, which is the gender wage gap. He addresses what he calls the estrogen feedback loop, asserting that the wage gap is an absolute myth perpetuated by the laptop class.
Right.
Riker argues that men earn more money simply because they are willing to do the dirty, physically destroying, dangerous jobs that keep the lights on. They are the ones doing underwater welding on oil rigs in freezing water. They are the ones diffusing IEDs. They are the ones climbing high-voltage power lines during hurricanes.
And he grounds this argument in a truly sobering statistic that is difficult to refute. 92% of all workplace fatalities are men.
Right. And he argues that modern society is perfectly happy to let men die by the thousands in the literal trenches, doing the invisible labor of civilization. But the moment you look at a safe, air-conditioned corporate boardroom, society suddenly demands strict 50-50 gender equity.
It is a remarkably powerful rhetorical point, and it resonates deeply with working-class men who feel entirely invisible to the educated urban elite who dictate corporate policy.
But let me offer a different perspective here. Moving away from Riker's hyper-combative framing, I want to look at corporate culture like an immune system, okay?
Okay, I like that.
Let's imagine that corporate America in the 1950s, the classic Mad Men era, was a body. Now, that body was undeniably infected with a real pathogen: overt sexism, exclusion, and deep-seated prejudice. It was a boys' club that locked out brilliant minds. So the body developed antibodies to fight the pathogen. We created HR departments, civil rights laws, and inclusion initiatives.
The necessary medical intervention, basically.
Yes, but here is the mechanism of an autoimmune disease.
Huh.
What happens when the pathogen is mostly contained, but the antibodies keep multiplying? Riker might actually be identifying a real phenomenon where the corporate immune system has become hyper-reactive. It is now attacking its own healthy tissue meritocracy, efficiency, male ambition, harmless banter, in an endless, frantic attempt to eradicate a virus that is no longer the primary threat.
That is a far more nuanced and useful metaphor than Riker's claim of deliberate Marxist sabotage. An autoimmune response isn't malicious. It's a protective system that has lost its regulatory mechanism.
But the problem with Riker's book is that he doesn't want to recalibrate the immune system. He looks at the autoimmune disease, highlights the most extreme, absurd symptoms like Yale's privilege walk, and uses them to justify a total regression. He wants to kill the antibodies entirely and return to the 1950s boys' club, ignoring the original pathogen that caused the problem in the first place.
Well, because in Riker's ideology, the 1950s boys' club wasn't a disease system. He views that historical hierarchy as the natural, optimal state of human organization that was unfairly dismantled.
And how do these captured institutions maintain this autoimmune overdrive and prevent anyone from pointing out the absurdity? According to Riker, They do it through the absolute weaponization of language. This brings us to a massive component of his theory, which he calls the speech wars and the gynocratic gulag.
This taps into the concept of linguistic determinism. If you control the boundaries of allowable language, you control the boundaries of allowable thought. Riker believes that shifting speech codes, dictating what words can be used, how people must be addressed, and what opinions are classified as harmful, are the primary enforcement mechanisms of the matriarchy.
He highlights some terrifying legal and social consequences to prove this point, too. He shares the story of an independent blogger who was allegedly jailed for 18 months under new cyber misogyny statutes.
Oh, this is wild.
And what was this man's horrific crime? He wrote a blog post complaining about his ex-wife's royalty-funded plastic surgery, stating that her new nose job made her look like a squashed clementine.
18 months in a physical prison for a fruit metaphor.
It sounds like a dystopian novel. And then there's a case of Bob the accountant, pulled from the Cato Institute legal files. Bob was a 60-year-old man who walked into a conference room and addressed his two female superiors by saying, "Good morning, ladies."
And he was fired.
He was immediately fired. He didn't use a slur. He didn't use profanity. He used the word ladies, which HR deemed a microaggression that assumed gender binaries.
Riker uses Bob the accountant to illustrate a chilling reality for his readers. The rules of engagement are changing daily. They are not based on common sense, and they are specifically designed to be impossible for a traditional, well-meaning man to navigate without eventually stumbling into a fireable offense.
But Riker doesn't just want men to live in fear of stumbling. He presents heroes of these speech wars. He highlights men who didn't just stumble, but who actively and aggressively rejected the vocabulary of their accusers.
The men who refused the struggle session.
Exactly. Let's talk about Chad Brewster. Chad was a barista working at a corporate Starbucks in Seattle. A sociology major got angry at him and loudly called him a latte heteropatriarch. Now, standard corporate procedure would dictate that Chad apologize to de-escalate the situation. Chad refused. He quit his job on the spot. But he didn't go hide. He opened an independent masculinity roast pop-up coffee shop across the street.
Incredible.
He put a massive sign on the door labeling it an estrogen-free zone, and he exclusively sold espresso and black mugs that had the words male tears printed on the side in bold white letters.
It is a masterclass in leaning into the insult. He took the weapon out of the sociology student's hands and monetizes it.
And then we have Hank McAllister, a heavy-duty welder from Texas. Hank suffered a devastating loss. He lost full custody of his children in a family court battle after he went on Facebook and called his ex-wife's court-appointed therapist a pronoun-peddling harpy. The system crushed him. But how did Hank respond? He didn't issue an apology. He went to a hardware store, bought a $200 metal smoker, and launched a YouTube channel called The Uncancelable BBQ. In his videos, he literally smokes massive racks of ribs while using laminated university gender studies textbooks as kindling for the fire. Riker notes that Hank now has a massive online following and a lucrative meat sponsorship.
These anecdotes perfectly encapsulate what Riker calls his 3 laws of anti-woke communication. The most critical foundational law being never, under any circumstances, apologize for biological reality.
Right.
What Riker is doing here is teaching his readers a radical new defensive posture.
Because the old posture doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. For the last 10 years, the standard public relations advice when you got caught in a social media storm was to issue a somber notes app apology on Twitter, promise to listen and do the work, and beg the mob for forgiveness.
Yep.
But as we established when we discussed woke puritanism, the mob offers no absolution. Riker has correctly realized that in the modern digital arena, an apology is just blood in the water. It signals weakness, invalidates the mob's premise.
So the strategy is aggressive, relentless mockery.
Yes. He advocates for humor, sarcasm, and unapologetic defiance. He views humor as a shield that completely deflates the sanctimony of cancel culture. You cannot cancel a man who is laughing at you while he smokes ribs over your ideology.
Okay, let's critically unpack this strategy. If we look at the reality of the modern workplace, it is a highly sensitive, heavily regulated HR environment. If you are a guy navigating that environment, is Riker's strategy actually viable?
Probably not.
Right. If you feel you are being treated unfairly, is the solution to become a provocative troll? Is acting like Chad the barista actually effective career advice for the average guy working at a logistics company in Ohio? Or does it just guarantee that he will be instantly fired, socially ostracized, and unable to pay his mortgage? It feels like incredibly dangerous advice for 99% of the population who just need to feed their families.
For the average employee trying to survive in a Fortune 500 company, you are absolutely right. Acting like Chad or Hank is professional suicide. You will lose your income. But you have to remember Riker's underlying radical goal. He actually wants these men to be fired from those institutions.
Wait, what? He wants them fired.
Yeah, he believes those corporate institutions are fundamentally irredeemable and inherently toxic to the male spirit. If a man gets fired for refusing to state his pronouns or refusing to participate in a privilege walk, Riker views that not as a tragic loss of a job, but as an emancipation.
Getting canceled is a feature, not a bug.
Precisely. It forces the man out of the wage cuck matrix, severing his dependence on the corporate immune system, and forces him into the parallel economy where he has to rely on his own sovereignty.
Which brings us to the most practical, actionable part of the book. Once a man has been fired, once he has rejected the speech codes, once he has taken the red pill and opted out of modern dating to protect his assets, what does he actually do on a Tuesday morning?
Right.
Riker's answer lies in sheer, unapologetic physical and digital sovereignty.
Having rejected the abstract, bureaucratic world, Riker directs men to return to the only foundation of reality they can completely control, which is their own physical bodies.
He introduces a concept he calls the loaded bar principle. Riker literally claims that every 45-pound iron plate a man adds to a barbell on a squat rack mathematically destroys 1.7 corporate DEI initiatives through what he beautifully terms gravitational truth.
Gravitational truth. It's a highly poetic, almost mystical way of saying that the laws of physics do not care about your feelings or your sociology degree.
Yep.
You cannot socially construct a 300-pound deadlift. You cannot talk your way into lifting the weight. It requires discipline, testosterone, biological effort, and an adherence to objective reality.
He aggressively contrasts this physical gravitational reality with the digital rot of modern youth. Like, he spends a whole chapter analyzing something called the wet sock challenge on TikTok.
Yeah.
Apparently, this is a viral trend symbolizing chronic masturbation and digital degeneracy. Riker views this as the ultimate symbol of digital castration young men wasting their biological drive for the amusement of a Chinese algorithm. He contrasts that hyper-online paralysis with his own lifestyle protocol, which is a 90-day dopamine detox combined with the SCORE method.
SCORE being an acronym for sweat, create, own, resist, expand.
Right. Chop physical wood, lift heavy weights, build a tangible object, own your land, resist digital temptation.
And this intense emphasis on physical capacity naturally bleeds over into hardcore survivalism and what Riker terms frontier justice. Because if you believe the institutions are collapsing, you have to be prepared to physically defend what you have built.
He relies heavily on the events of the 2020 Minneapolis riots to prove this necessity. While the police retreated and the city burned, Riker recounts the story of a group of local bikers who just quietly stood outside a neighborhood hardware store holding shotguns. There were no committee meetings on racial equity, there were no de-escalation seminars, there was just a hard, physical, biological boundary that the mob refused to cross. He contrasts the failure of the bureaucratic state with the success of raw male capability.
He's totally obsessed with tactical tradecraft.
He praises things like the Home Depot pressure washer modification. This is where guys figured out how to take $40 worth of PVC pipe and turn a standard garden pressure washer into a riot control human fire hose.
Oh.
He also tells a story of a Fortune 500 CEO who, during a localized supply chain breakdown, allegedly had to trade a $30,000 Rolex watch just to get 50 pounds of rice from a prepper.
The intersection of physical fitness, tactical capability, and off-grid survivalism is the beating heart of this subculture. Riker's philosophy treats the male body as the final, uncancelable asset. When the banks freeze your digital accounts, when HR permanently deletes your corporate Slack profile, when the Twitter mob ruins your reputation, your bone density, your muscle fiber, and your knowledge of agriculture remain.
It's the ultimate insurance policy.
I connect this directly back to his evolutionary framing.
Yeah.
He believes a systemic collapse is inevitably coming. He references the 3 a.m. rule, the idea that society is always just 3 missed meals away from total chaotic anarchy.
Yeah.
In that scenario, an academic degree in sociology or an MBA in corporate synergy is entirely worthless. Raw physical capability and the ability to project force supersede all modern status markers.
But let me challenge the practical reality of this philosophy. Lifting weights is undeniably good for your health, your cardiovascular system, and your mental state. I think everyone agrees on that.
Sure.
But does deadlifting actually dismantle a corporate HR department? Does buying PVC pipe at Home Depot change the family court laws? It feels like there's a serious element of magical thinking embedded in the manosphere.
Magical thinking.
Yeah, it's like they believe if I bench press 225 pounds, the matriarchy will instantly fall. Equating gym gains with geopolitical or economic resistance seems like a massive illogical leap.
What you are highlighting the fundamental difference between individual psychological empowerment and actual systemic change. You are right. Lifting weights does not magically rewrite corporate policy or dismantle an HR department.
Right.
But it radically changes the individual man's psychological relationship to that HR department. A man who feels physically capable, sovereign, and self-reliant is significantly less likely to cower and apologize when HR demands his compliance. The magical thinking you identified is actually functioning as psychological armor.
Oh, I see.
It's about building a profound internal locus of control in a world that constantly tells these men they are inherently toxic, privileged, and powerless.
Internal locus of control. Okay, that makes perfect sense. The weight room is the one place where input always equals output. But what happens when that internal armor isn't enough?
Good question.
What happens when a man is as strong as he can possibly be, but the legal and corporate systems still make living in the West unbearable for him? That brings us to our final act, the most extreme portion of the book. We have arrived at Riker's endgame. If the West is truly lost to what he creatively dubs feminine spatial communism,
A truly wild, conceptually bizarre string of words.
the branding is incredible, you have to admit. But if the West is lost to this ideology, what is the ultimate exit strategy for the red-pilled man?
Well, first, he has to define the nightmare he believes he is running from. He has to convince the reader that the system is beyond saving.
Right. He describes what he calls nightmare matriarchies. He points to localized examples like modern corporate gyms that have literally banned heavy free weights and squat racks because the grunting and the heavy iron are deemed too intimidating and exclusionary.
Yeah.
He takes these micro examples and extrapolates them into a macro theory he calls uterine myopia.
This is a heavily pseudoscientific claim. Riker argues that female-led institutions only optimize for short-term 28-day comfort cycles, focusing on feelings, safety, and consensus, rather than the harsh, calculated long-term sacrifice required for a 100-year empire building.
He is essentially dressing up raw biological misogyny in the academic language of evolutionary psychology.
Pretty much.
He is fundamentally arguing that women are biologically incapable of maintaining the harsh physical realities of the civilizations that men historically did.
Exactly. He is declaring the Western project functionally dead.
So because the civilization is crumbling under this nightmare matriarchy, Rucker offers the exit strategies. And these strategies read like they were pulled straight out of a dystopian cyberpunk novel.
They really do.
They are incredible. He tells the story of a man named Jax Turner. Jax is a rogue Bitcoin miner living completely off the grid in the remote Montana Rockies.
The Montana guy, right.
According to Riker, Jax is powering a massive, highly profitable server farm using hydroelectricity. He is illegally siphoning from a local river. He is defending this compound with a private security team of ex-Marines holding Barrett .50 caliber sniper rifles.
Unbelievable.
And supposedly, when federal agents show up to inspect the property, Jax blasts Flight of the Valkyries over a massive PA system until the feds get frustrated and leave.
Jax Turner operates as a modern-day techno-warlord.
Yeah.
He is Riker's ideal archetype of the new man.
Totally. He takes Jax's example and outlines the Five Flags 2.0 strategy. This is a complex method for internationally diversifying your assets, your passports, and your businesses so that no single government can ever freeze your life.
Right.
He talks about spermignation clusters, which is his bizarre term for groups of high net worth, red-pilled men moving en masse to low-tax, low-regulation zones, specifically to outbreed the welfare state.
The creation of parallel societies.
He highlights the Honduras Prosper Project, which is a real charter city where traditional legal systems and DEI officers have allegedly been replaced by blockchain-verified reputation scores. And my personal favorite anecdote in the entire book, Eric the Red.
Oh, this one is wild.
Eric is apparently a rogue financier wanted by the SEC who used his crypto wealth to buy a private Fijian atoll. And on this atoll, Riker claims corporate or HR disputes are legally settled with actual flintlock dueling pistols at dawn.
Wait, literal flintlock pistols?
Little flintlocks, yeah.
We really have to examine this Phoenix Protocol critically. Riker brings up another concept, the Peter Pan pandemic, noting that a staggering 68% of men under the age of 30 are still sleeping in their childhood bedrooms, unable to afford a home or start a family. What Riker is doing here is masterful marketing. He isn't just selling these disenfranchised young men political anger, he is selling them a deeply romantic, frontier-style escapism. The fantasy of seasteading on the ocean, of building impenetrable crypto fortresses in the mountains, of settling disputes with dueling pistols on a private island, it is intoxicating.
It is.
It serves as a comic book hero origin story for men who currently feel like background, non-playable characters in a society that actively hates them.
But wait, think about the massive glaring irony of this entire conclusion.
Yeah.
Riker spends the entire preface and 23 dense chapters screaming at the top of his lungs that men built civilization. We built the cathedrals, we built the bridges, we wired the electrical grid, we conquered the wilderness. But his ultimate crowning solution to the problems of modernity is to run away from civilization, to abandon the cities they built and hide on a Fijian atoll, or hunker down in a remote Montana mountain with stolen river electricity. Isn't this an admission of total, unconditional defeat? You are not rebuilding Rome, you are just fleeing the barbarians and leaving the city to burn.
It is the ultimate paradox of his entire manifesto. He violently demands that men act like conquerors, but his final tactical blueprint is a survival strategy for exiles.
Right.
However, if Riker were sitting here with us, he would likely argue that you cannot rebuild Rome while the current corrupt emperors are still in charge of the military and the treasury. The Phoenix Protocol isn't about running away permanently, it is about strategic patience.
Strategic patience.
Yeah, it is about letting the current corrupted system burn to ash, letting the nightmare matriarchies inevitably collapse under the weight of their own biological incompetence, while the capable men preserve the fire of civilization, the capital, and the genetic strength in these remote parallel enclaves.
They are essentially waiting in the mountains until the world begs them to return and fix the plumbing.
Precisely. It is a deeply apocalyptic vision of the future, but for his readers, the men stuck in their childhood bedrooms or the men living in U-Haul trucks after a divorce, it is a profoundly hopeful one. It tells them that their current suffering is just the prelude to their eventual vindication.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at the cultural seismograph, we've analyzed the jagged lines of the fatherless apocalypse, the brutal economics of the simp economy, the Maoist structure of corporate struggle sessions, and the wild cyberpunk reality of the Fiji exit strategies.
Quite the journey.
I want to leave the listener with a final thought to really mull over something outside of just Riker's specific rhetoric.
Well, I think the vital takeaway from this entire exploration is this. Whether you find Conrad Riker's Red Pill Reckoning to be a work of brilliant, suppressed truth, or you find it to be offensive, mathematically flawed, and completely absurd, you absolutely cannot ignore the reality it represents. There is a massive growing demographic of men who feel this book perfectly describes their lived reality. The real question we should be asking as a society isn't whether Riker's specific statistics about male bowerbirds, or his historical comparisons to the Knights Templar, are perfectly peer-reviewed by academia.
No.
The real terrifying question is this. What happens to a civilization when millions of its young men decide to officially secede from its core institutions? What happens when they stop marrying, stop striving for promotion in the corporate world, stop paying taxes, and stop believing in the shared American project?
When the builders put down their tools, walk into the woods, and refuse to participate. It's chilling, monumental thought.
History shows us that a society cannot survive the passive strike of its young men.
And that is exactly why we do this show. To peer into the dark, complicated corners of the culture, bypassing the mainstream outrage and decoding what is really happening beneath the surface. I want to remind you, the listener, to please hit that like and subscribe button.
Yes, please do.
Your support is the only thing that helps us continue to bring you these sprawling, unfiltered, architectural deep dives into the topics no one else will touch. And I want to reinforce that to fully grasp the raw, unfiltered nature of this subculture we just unpacked, you really should check out Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books to buy a copy of Red Pill Reckoning for yourself.
It's definitely worth reading.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to see how this philosophy is evolving in real time.
There is absolutely no substitute for reading the primary source material yourself and drawing your own conclusions.
Exactly. We started today talking about seismographs, tectonic plates, and scientific precision. And maybe the instruments are broken, and maybe the lines on the graph are murky, but after reading Riker and decoding the manosphere, one thing is undeniably clear. The ground beneath our feet is definitely moving. Thank you so much for taking this incredibly deep, complex plunge into the source material with us today. We'll see you on the next deep dive.